Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Justine, and I'm from We Work Remotely. And today, as you know, we have an event or a webinar with Justin, who is the founder of Yak. And before I hand it over to him, just one quick note about today's format. We're going to keep it pretty casual. So throughout the event, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat, and Justin will get to them pretty quickly. So I guess without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Justin. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, sounds good. So as Justine said, just please ask questions, spam them in here. I know I see a couple names that have heard me speak before, so they're familiar with the fact that I typically like to take a lot of questions here. I don't present, I don't do presentations. Thank you, Tyler, for the air horns. So please just feel free to spam questions into the Q&A button and I will get to them. So I'm going to just kind of chat for a little bit and give you kind of like my top level thoughts, and then feel free to interject in between with questions, or we can just get to a kind of Q&A round at the very end. So, the topic of today's discussion, at least the title of this webinar was how to manage a dev team. And a lot of what I do as CEO, I also play a role as CTO right now because we don't have a separate role for that at Yak. But I've been doing that for years. I've run a design agency called So Friendly. So that meant that I was not only kind of like creative director at an agency, but I was also, generally speaking, running all the technology as well. So I've gotten used to working with devs and designers across, kind of multiple teams inside of an agency environment, and then transition that into a startup as well. And when you're at a startup, you wear many hats and you have to kind of learn to juggle those different responsibilities. So I'm going to talk a lot today about kind of the perspective from a founder, but also if you're a CTO and you're here, I think a lot of this information will be helpful to you as well. So, I have a couple rules that I think help keep our machine moving and prevent us from kind of chugging or, getting into this kind of like churn state where we're not moving quickly. I definitely kind of go with the standard startup methodology of move fast and break things. I think there's a good movement right now in startup culture that kind of rails against that. But I will openly admit that that is my style, that I would rather ship and learn something from shipping than kind of like be afraid to ship because maybe something isn't perfect. And so I've been doing that for many years now. And that's kind of been a secret sauce of mine, is this idea of you don't learn if you don't ship. So in that kind of regard, a lot of what I do is systemize our dev teams around that kind of thinking. And what that means is cutting down on meetings, cutting down on a lot of decision time, right? Just make a decision, ship it. If that's not the right decision, we'll fix it later. And that kind of style of thinking, I think a lot of times goes against the grain. It's not what people are used to. We definitely have devs on our team that are very used to kind of the perfectionist style of, well, no, I can't ship this because there might be bugs. And it's something that we, certainly have to work at inside of a startup, is maintaining that style of work. So I have a couple systems that will help with that. The first is I have a 3-hour rule. So I like to ship fast. And that also means that I don't like to see developers sitting on their hands. And I also don't like meetings. All of those things combined mean that I can't have a developer that's just sitting there not doing anything because they're relying on some other developer to do their work, or designer, whoever it may be. I typically don't like having any sprints set up in a system in which someone cannot be successful on their own because someone else hasn't done their task yet. And so that's why I've implemented the 3-hour rule. So if anything takes longer than 3 hours to get done, I just want that person to tell me, because there's typically one of three reasons why that's happening. Either A, the task is not possible, meaning I gave them something that the technology isn't available for it yet. The API endpoint isn't available. The kind of the code base or the plugin, doesn't exist and would have to be created, or Apple doesn't allow it. Who knows what it might be, but it's not possible, right? There's a reason why it hasn't been done yet. It's too difficult to do, or the technology doesn't exist. And so typically I'll just remove the task. So I'm a huge fan of simplification. Part of that simplification commonly can just be, we're not doing that. Forget it, move on to something else. I don't want somebody to sit there and churn on that all day long. So that's reason number one. It just wasn't possible. Reason number two is that it's too big of a task. And typically what that really breaks down to is that we didn't take that task and break it down into a small enough chunk. I love breaking down tasks into more simplified versions of themselves for a number of reasons. One of those is easy wins. Developers really hate it when they feel like they're not gaining any ground, where they feel like I've been working and working, and I haven't pushed anything. We haven't released anything. It just doesn't feel like I've completed a task in a very long time. And a lot of that kind of like brain fog comes from having tasks that are way too large and ambiguous that it never really feels like you're accomplishing anything. And so a lot of times, if a developer comes back and they say, hey, I've been working on this task for 3 hours, just letting you know, I'll say, okay, why? And they'll say, oh, well, I mean, this is like an 18-hour task or a 20-hour task where it's 2 weeks to get this thing done, whatever it might be. So what I'll typically do is say, okay, stop. Let's break this into much smaller chunks, right? And the reason for that is once they finish chunk one, they get to go, hey, yay, I won, like I finished it, I got that first chunk done. But the second reason is really that it helps you understand the simplification of a task, and you might actually end up doing an easier version of it now that you've broken it into smaller chunks. It's harder to get kind of that like writer's block that you get when you're coding, because you're not thinking about this huge grand scheme of things. You may discover something along the way that actually makes the entire system more simple overall. And in general, depending on how you actually code it, it might give you something you could ship, right? So if we wanted to build group functionality into our app. Actually, the way that groups work today in Yak is a great example. Groups and chat apps are always very complicated because you have an admin of a group, and then you have members, and then you can, rename the group and change the members. And you might want to hand off admin control to another member of the group. And so there's all this like very complicated stuff centered around just group messaging. And so when we were at our agency, a lot of times we'd say, just don't do group messaging. There's way too much stuff that it, falls out of that. It's a snowball effect of features. And so, Yak, actually, the way that groups and channels work today is based off of this idea of, what? Anybody can add anybody to a channel. Anybody can remove anybody from a channel. Anybody can change the name of the channel. And that's how you get the feature out there, and it works. And no one's ever really complained about the lack of these like crazy admin control features that every other app has, because you probably just don't really need them, and you'd never notice that you don't have them because technically everybody has them, because everyone is an admin of all the channels that they're in. And that's just like a way that I get a feature out there and say, you know what, we're just not even going to worry about it right now. And we learn a lot, and what we'll end up finding out is maybe that wasn't even a feature that anybody needed. Maybe channels or groups aren't even a feature that people needed. And so when we go back to do this later, it ends up not even being a task on our plate. So that second one is always just breaking things down, simplifying actions, because you typically will find out that it's not actually as complex as you thought it was, and you get that easy win. So the third one for this 3-hour rule is a very simple one. It's maybe the task is assigned to the wrong person. I found this out a lot in my agency. I was building a lot of presentation decks for people, and I hated it. I really it was just not what I wanted to do. I didn't like putting together sales decks. It was boring. It's not an app. It wasn't fun. It's just not the type of design I like doing. And I kept having this issue where my partner was always saying like, hey, the pitch is live in, 15 minutes. The deck's not ready yet, or it doesn't look complete. Like, dude, this is not that hard. Like, why are we failing at this? And it finally just came down to like, I hate doing it. I don't want to do it. I just don't like doing this task. It's taking me forever because it's the worst thing in the world to me. And we found another designer who ends up loving making these presentation decks, and assigning it to him was like the magic fix. Once he started doing it, they were done way in advance. They worked way better. They looked better. The clients were way happier, and I was happier because I wasn't doing a task that I didn't like. So a lot of times I found, specifically with developers, is that sometimes you're assigning a task to the wrong person, whether it's just the way that that person thinks, whether it's front end or back end. It's just the style of work it is. Some people like to work on, very remedial, like algorithmic type things. They just want to see math do its work, and they love that. Some people like working on an animation because it gets them this kind of like front end magic where they see something cool happen. And you got to find that kind of tick inside of your development team, find out who likes what type of development. It makes a huge difference in kind of the efficiency of your team as you start to shift tasks around and realize like what tasks certain people are attracted to and what they like to do. So all those things combined go into this 3-hour rule, which is if anything's taking longer than 3 hours, just tell me and we'll figure out why it's taking longer than 3 hours. The most common thing, I think, is typically just simplification. Let's figure out why you think this is this huge task. And to that vein, I typically say to myself, I won't assign a task that's longer than 3 hours. That means that on my end, before I even give someone a task, I've gone through the process of trying to simplify it. And one of the biggest things that I tell my team now is if you think this is longer than a 3-hour task, tell me so that I can just ahead of time break that down for you so that you're not going off and working in kind of like a heads down mode, stuck churning out something that maybe is 10 times more complicated than I really needed it to be. Because at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff is communication based. What I've said might sound way more complex than it really is because I did a poor job of explaining it. Now, obviously, this is where things like Yak come into play because I'm allowed to use my voice, which I obviously like speaking. It's the best way for me to think out loud is to actually talk like this. And so a lot of times we'll use Yak to send over these very complex tasks because I get to have this high bandwidth, high resolution channel of communication that's not text based to actually send over a task. And then a lot of times what we'll do now is we actually have the developer write their own GitHub ticket. And what this actually causes is that I get to use a method of communication that I'm most comfortable with, kind of like off the cuff speaking, and then they get to document it in this very black and white fashion. And then I get to sanity check that. So it typically the flow will be is that I will give a task and what I think is the most simplified version of it, I will give that to a developer over voice. They will then write a GitHub ticket, send that back to me, and then I will just give a thumbs up and say, hey, yep, this is exactly, what I said, or actually, no, this is more complicated than it needs to be, or wow, you're right. This was way more complicated than I thought it was. Let's just skip it. It's not worth it. Right. And that's typically a lot of the flow of things from a tasking perspective is figuring out really if it's worth it to put all that time and energy into something if it's going to take that long. And so that's a lot of how I optimize the team. So, if we move past, I guess, specific to developers and just talk about managing a team, a lot of that goes into meeting culture. I was thinking about this ahead of this talk today about how I would illustrate this, and I had kind of a funny epiphany. We've been fostering 2 boys lately, 2 brothers. This means that we interface with the foster care system a lot. And one of the things that came out of this was they're very involved in your lives. I did not realize how involved the actual foster care system gets in your lives once you get foster children. They have to meet with you constantly throughout the month, multiple times, multiple people. And they actually come to your house as well. So it's not just like a phone call. They have to like physically show up, check the bedrooms, make sure that these kids are, in a good environment, which it makes sense. It just was not something that I was prepared for. And a lot of times, because they're not set up like a startup, these meetings came very last minute. And so they would just out of nowhere say, hey, I have to meet tomorrow before 6 p.m. Like legally, I have to meet with you or I'm not going to be able to check this box. So we had to end up actually pushing back to them and saying, you need to give us a 2 weeks notice for meetings. Like we're trying to give these kids a scheduled lifestyle, normalcy. They need to be able to, enjoy events, go to soccer practice, things like that. And they can't do that when you're just springing random meetings on us. And so we gave them a 2-week buffer that they had to give us that. We've got this one guy that he's the only one that doesn't meet with us virtually. Some of them will actually do Zoom calls, which is great. He's the only one of them that has to come physically. And I like to tell the story because I think it's illustrative of a lot of meetings. He will come into the house, he will sit down, and then he'll say, so you guys need anything? And we'll say, nope, all good on this end. And then he'll just kind of stare at us, nod, and say, okay. And then there's like a really awkward amount of 5-minute silence where we all kind of look at each other. And it reminds me a lot of startup meetings where there wasn't like a lot of preparation ahead of time. It was kind of last minute. He didn't have like a real purpose for being there. So he's struggling to figure out even what to talk about, but he has to be there. So he's just kind of staring at us awkwardly and we're all staring awkwardly back at him. And, a lot of that has to do with how I think about startup meetings as well. Always have a purpose, plan these things like way in advance. No like meeting of meeting, day before. 2 weeks is probably like a really long shot, but it's a really, really good buffer time before you're going to have a meeting. And so what that means is that most of our communication is async. We do everything over Yak, emails, and Slack. And even inside of Slack, we treat it like a very asynchronous channel. We don't treat it like a real-time channel. And that asynchronous behavior not only helps you inside of kind of like respecting everyone else's time zones and their need for actually deep work, but it also allows you to have a purpose when you talk and think ahead of time about what you're going to say. We're really, really anti kind of like the Discord chat room style things. And the reason is exactly like Mike, who shows up at our house and just kind of looks at us. Because what you end up doing, and I did this yesterday, we were actually just testing a feature out in Yak called Yak Rooms. And somebody hopped into a room with me. We basically finished our conversation. And at the very end, there was this incredibly long lull of, okay, well, I guess we finished everything. So goodbye, I guess. And then we awkwardly hung up on this call. And it may not seem like a lot, but that kind of like open-ended, when does this meeting end, is a huge problem in startups. If you don't have a definitive beginning and an end to a conversation, it's very hard to get out of that conversation, as well as understand your own timetable, know when the meeting is going to end so that you can move on to your next task. And I know for a lot of people that are listening in here, I see Adrian's name. I used to work with Adrian. It's a huge problem even when a meeting has a defined end. So synchronous meetings inherently have this problem because you have the ability to push the meeting past its designated end. And so there's a huge problem inside of just sync meeting culture in general, where there is no enforcement of kind of that meeting end. It's funny, having the 45-minute limit on a Zoom trial is actually probably the best startup hack you could ever have, because it just drops the call at 45 minutes, which is exactly what should happen with a meeting. It should just in the meeting. And the problem with these kind of like sync meeting tools and a lot of the kind of like remote team virtual office stuff that's being offered today is that there is no definitive beginning and end. There's no agenda. And there's this kind of uncomfortable social aspect of like, how do I get out of this conversation? Am I the one to end the conversation? I hope they end the conversation. Oh, no, they're not ending the conversation. Don't they realize I have to do work now? And so that's why we shift everything async. So, not only does it, allow for kind of the inclusivity of people who don't want to be on a stage, people who may not be comfortable speaking up on live, events like this, but also people who are asleep or happen to be focused and doing their work at the time. So async not only is more inclusive to those folks, but it also gets rid of this problem of kind of the social construct of like, how do I get out of this conversation? Async, you get to control your own time and you're respecting everybody else's time. And that's a huge part of our communication workflow, is that everything needs to be done async as much as possible. And that doesn't mean that a meeting never happens. There's definitely times to talk, first time conversations for one thing, or a great time to hop on a Zoom call and talk to somebody. But as you start to create that as like the norm for, communication moving forward, it actually causes this problem of time that's wasted just trying to have a conversation and then get out of that conversation. So we definitely recommend, going async. A couple other tips that I always want to talk about when you're working with a dev team or you're working with designers, really have to do with kind of like that shifting of tasks that I talked about at the very beginning. The way that I set up tasks is in such a way that I've chunked it up into such a small segment of work that it is only one person's responsibility to do that work. This also helps prevent the meetings that we're trying to, get rid of. So if you don't have anyone that you have to talk to accomplish your work, then you don't have to have a meeting. So by actually setting up my tasking around preventing meetings, I'm building a culture of anti-meeting, communication just by how I do my tasking, because a lot of meetings are set up because of this fear of communication loss. Typically, you see meetings set up because someone is afraid that someone is out of sync. You don't set up meetings because you just love talking to other people. You set up meetings because you're afraid of what happens if they don't talk, right? And so the reason why I'm so against meetings happens to coincide with exactly how I give tasks, which is preventing that waterfall effect of someone working on something not being able to be successful because somebody else is working on another task. So I'm constantly shifting kind of schedules around and shifting priorities around to ensure that everything is firing all the time and no one's ever waiting on anyone else. And what the kind of Result of that is that nobody is constantly trying to get into contact with somebody else because they need help to finish their task. They've owned 100% of whatever task they're working on currently, and they're able to do that task. Now, there's nothing wrong with asking questions. We're a big fan of, asking for help, asking for questions, telling someone you're stuck. But if you set up your task in such a way that you're not reliant on someone else as much as being able to get help from someone else, then you're not being pushed into these meetings all the time because you have to update somebody on what else you're doing. You have to tell them, hey, my stuff is done. Let me give you a demo of it. So we typically chunk all of our tasks up in such a way that you're solely responsible for what you're working on. Again, doesn't mean that you don't get to ask for help, pull somebody in, say, hey, I can't complete this. Can you do it for me? We definitely encourage that, especially around that 3-hour rule of, hey, this task wasn't meant for me. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to give it to you and you can give me whatever you're working on. And that happens all the time. But by not having a reliance on somebody else, you don't have to have that meeting to be able to discuss the thing that you're working on. So a lot of that is just ways that we keep everything firing in a way that we're able to ship fast. Part of that means that when we ship fast, there's bugs. I definitely take a stance of the rough around the edges style product. As long as you're providing something that's stable, there will always be bugs in software. My stance typically is that expect bugs. Bugs mean that we're working, we're innovating, we're moving fast. I think Twitter is probably the greatest example of kind of the balance between producing software and not producing software, right? We saw for years Twitter was just like doing nothing. I always like to ask the funny question of like, what does a engineer at Twitter do every single day? Like they haven't produced anything new in years. And then all of a sudden you see them just like producing all kinds of, new features. And now they're building in public, they're sharing their designs on Twitter all the time. And you can see this huge difference between a style of like almost being afraid of producing something new because you're not sure how it's going to be, taken. And then this new style of I'm just going to put everything out there and you're just going to tell me exactly what you think about it. And we're really big fans of the latter. Like that's a big part of our style, not necessarily building in public, but also this style of, putting something out there, getting feedback on it, and allowing that to be the kind of way that we drive our development cycle instead of being afraid of putting out something that might be less than perfect. Everything will be less than perfect all the time. And it's something I've consciously had to break a lot of our developers of is this concept of like, this is my work of art. It needs to be perfect. I need to spend more time on it. I need to prune it more. There's a huge fear there, I think, about putting something out that might be a little rough around the edges. And we try and break our team of that as much as possible. I'm going to talk about one more thing, and I think we're just going to probably dive into questions here. So feel free to start filling up the Q&A. A huge part of how we have produced so much so quickly across agency work, Yak in general, just little side projects, has to do with how we hire. A big part of that is I highly, highly, highly suggest utilizing offshore development teams. A big part of scale in a startup is offshore a lot of times. The great thing about utilizing offshore is that you get this huge team with very little risk to you. So you don't have to hire in the States. You don't have to pay, payroll taxes, health insurance, all these 401k, but you get a massive amount of labor out of it, right? So we've been utilizing an offshore team for 10 plus years now. And that doesn't mean that we don't hire in the States as well. I think there's a very ethnocentric, rah-rah American attitude that a lot of startups have, which is that, well, I want to create jobs here in America. I actually had a local startup here in Orlando we were going to partner with. They actually pulled out of the partnership because they were mad that we hired offshore and didn't hire in the States because, quote, he wanted to create jobs in America. So I asked him how many people he had employed, and he said 2. And I said, great, I've got 12. So I've actually created more jobs in America, more higher paying American jobs, simply because we've been able to actually scale our agency up higher than yours because we utilized offshore teams. And a lot of times it has to do with kind of like this actual scaling system, right? So we started with 100% offshore. We hired, one local dev. Then we actually, scaled back our offshore a little bit and hired another local dev, right? And we've continued to do this as we've produced, more features, more apps, more content. And over time, we've scaled down the offshore side to just 2 people, right? And it used to be 15. But those 15 people cost about the same exact amount of money, if not less, than one dev here in the States. And not only is this obviously a huge, push for remote, distributed, higher global, like I'm all about that. It's more so this concept of utilizing scale to get you to a certain point, and then bringing in, experts in each kind of individual field. Like a really good desktop dev was the first person we hired, because the offshore team didn't have kind of a dedicated understanding of desktop development. They did mobile and web. And so we hired a specific dev for desktop, and he's been amazing, right? And then as we started to build out more, I realized we needed a very dedicated backend developer that could work on some very specific stuff for us and be able to like maintain stuff when India is offline and we're awake here in EST. So that was the next hire that we made, right? So we just keep scaling in these kind of like new hires. And over time, we're able to scale the offshore side down. I think there's a lot of fear of quality control. People are afraid of, utilizing offshore because of quality. I guarantee you, there's two options here. One, you just found the wrong team. They're just a group of bad developers, and that happens. It totally does. I lost thousands of dollars overseas before I found the team that I use today. But the flip side of that is that typically these devs are amazing devs, like amazing devs. They're really, really good devs. And the reason why they're sucking is because of your communication. Communication is like 90% of the battle when it comes to offshore development teams in general, but mostly development teams with a language barrier and a time zone difference. As long as you can master that communication, you can get massive, massive scale and tons of value out of an offshore team. And that kind of brings me to the next hiring hack that we've done for many years, which is interns. Our entire design team was made up of college interns. We hired our first designer, Heather, at So Friendly. I posted a job on a college job board, which is like the system that's actually like suggested, right? Like they have a system for this. It is for posting jobs for internships. Say what I was looking for. She applied. We accepted her internship. She gets credit. We have paid every single intern. I'm very big on paying interns. I don't believe in unpaid internships because I think everyone deserves to be paid for their work. And if I'm kind of teaching this college intern and telling her, hey, this is your work, you should be proud of it, you shouldn't, do spec work, whatever it is, I should be backing that up with a paycheck. It's not an amazing paycheck. I think we paid every single intern $10 an hour. The thing that is like they're not available 24/7. They're not, or, full time. They're in school, so they can't run typical hours. They're 10 to 15 hours a week typically. Sometimes they can reach up to like 20, but that's why we pay them $10 an hour. They get paid for their work. It's all tracked hourly. And typically it's really good work. The cool thing about interns is that once you find one, it's very easy to find the others. Why? Because that person who is in that class, as long as they're good, typically knows who else in that class is also really good. And so once we found one intern, she actually found us our second intern. That second intern found us our third, fourth, fifth intern, right? And they were all great because they were all part of the same friend group. And that meant that they all had a similar style of working. They all kind of were at the same level of education, and they all typically actually had different things that they were good at. So like Heather's really good at illustration, Raina's really good at kind of like web. And so like we have these different skill sets and they all kind of complemented each other, and they all came in at $10 an hour. I found them through a system that is actively looking for jobs. So, I posted on Twitter the other day a site called secondhandhires.com, because I have so many people that come to me that are looking for a job and we're just not hiring for that position, but there's a lot of other startups that are hiring. And the funny thing is that I found out about in this building this website was there is an insane amount of people looking to hire and they can't seem to ever find the talent. But then when you go to something like a college intern job board, you've got hundreds and hundreds of people with good talent who are looking for jobs. So if you can find a source of kind of like talent that is actively just pumping out people hungry for jobs, that includes things like Lambda School, boot camps, like coding boot camps, and internships from college. It's a huge source of talent that you can just immediately tap into, and you don't need recruiters. You don't need this massive interview process, because also with interns in general, there's a much lower risk to you. You don't have to worry about hiring a full-time employee and giving them benefits, because you're just hiring a part-time intern who's basically from the actual get-go guaranteed not to last, You don't have to keep them on because they're an intern. So the risk to you is very, very low. You get cheap work. It's typically very good work. And these people are very hungry, very willing to learn. So you have an opportunity to instill in them good habits, good skills. They're very teachable because they're in that kind of moment in their life. They're not senior devs and designers who don't want to learn because they're stuck in their ways. So you found like the ideal talent here in an intern. So it's an amazing opportunity to level up your team. Amelia, who I think is in this room right now, came to us as an intern and has been an amazing social media manager and content guy for our team. And he came in as a random intern, suggested from somebody that was connected to the college at the time. And he's, been part of our team ever since. So, you find these permanent hires very easily through internships. And so I definitely recommend, especially as a startup, I used to tell investors that I was cheap. And then I found out that through VC terminology, this is called capital efficient. And that's great. I love the term. It's awesome. It just means that I'm good with my money, right? It just means that I'm always looking 6 months out, trying to figure out how we get our next dime. How are we making money? How are we staying afloat? How am I paying the team, right? And so a lot of that has to do with finding labor that doesn't set me back, right? So we're able to pump out just a ridiculous amount of content and features and apps and products because I found a way to 10x scale my team without 10xing my actual pay, right? And that doesn't mean that I underpay people as well. It just means that I'm, hiring globally. Cost of living is different all over the world. I do not hire Silicon Valley engineers. We lost a seed round from an investor because he pulled his term sheet after we told him that we weren't going to hire talent in the Valley. And I just told him, look, I'm not going to spend that kind of money when I can find better or the same, if not better talent elsewhere. Florida being a huge part of that. Cost of living here is just nothing compared to the Valley. And so we love hiring people straight out of college, straight out of boot camps here in Florida. We have people that we've hired all around the world. Our lead backend developer travels to a different country nearly every week. And that was a huge part of him coming on board. He actually used to work for an agency in Seattle. They wouldn't let him travel because of their, hiring restrictions. And so he asked if he could come work for us. And huge part of that was the flexibility of just work for wherever. And we have a culture around this concept of like, it doesn't matter where you work, just work and get your stuff done. And I guess small tangent there, that is something that I'm really big on, is this concept of work as much as you want to work, as long as you get your stuff done. It doesn't matter to me if you work 8 hours a day. I'm not paying you for 8 hours a day. I'm paying you for your output. I do not care what your input is. I mostly care if your input is actually high. That's when I get worried and I go like, why are you putting a lot of hours into this? Either you're not prepared, or we didn't teach you enough, or you need to go spend some time learning before you come back to this, or, the task is wrong, that 3-hour rule, right? So typically I'm really in favor of like a 4-hour workday, right? If you can get all of your stuff done and you can get all your tasks, complete, then just stop work and go chill for the rest of the day. I'm really, really a fan of this because it not only allows for really good async communication, because it means that you don't have to have this like crazy 8-hour overlap. You can come online for like a couple hours just to make sure you can collaborate with somebody. And then you can just go back to whatever you're doing, whether that was sleep or just hanging out with your family. But that actually is really respectful to a lot of our interns, a lot of our offshore devs, and a lot of the people who like to travel. Is I don't need 8 hours out of you every day. I just need your work out of you. Whatever that, input amounts to, I don't really care. I'm not going to be like tracking your time and making sure that you're doing X number of work for the day. So, a big hack for managing a dev team is definitely not just hiring the top tippy top talent senior developer from California, paying them buku dollars, and then being confused why it takes you forever to produce content. Hire a ton of interns, a ton of offshore people, a ton of junior devs, build them up in your company over time. You'll save money and you'll have a huge team behind you that loves you, that's like, passionate about what they do because they learned on the job. They were given opportunities. Like, it creates a good work culture as well. So I'm going to dive into some comments here because we're about halfway done, or some Q&A, and we'll start answering questions. All right, Tyler says, how do you encourage devs to be empathetic to customer requests, needs, and experiences? This is a really good question. I would say that like out of the box, devs aren't. They're not. One of the ways that you can do that is by having devs on like your demo calls or customer success calls, if you do those. We're starting to do that on our end as well, just to kind of build not only empathy, but an understanding of like why when X feature breaks, it's a huge deal to somebody because they use that feature and it's like a critical feature. So I do think it's really good. I do think that there conversely actually just needs to be empathy on your end, that not everyone really cares what you're doing. I think that's one of the biggest things that I found in startups, especially with offshore, is that everyone is afraid of hiring offshore because of this like culture thing where they're like, well, I need somebody that's on my team that's bought into the mission and, wants to build what we're building. And I think that's a huge fallacy in general, because there's just a very high chance that not everyone really cares about you or your idea or your baby or whatever it is. It's your baby at the end of the day. So while I do think it's important to try to build that empathy, especially if you've got some like long-term devs that have been with you for a long time, and maybe you see them in maybe upper management roles and they're asking for equity, those are those times you start to get them involved in those calls. But I do think that there actually needs to be more of understanding on founder's side to typically say like, this dev just wants to punch in and punch out. And that's totally fine. Like, we have those people on our team and it's totally fine. There's no reason why they can't be like that. And I think a lot of startup founders don't go offshore, don't go college intern route, because they just want all these people that are going to go brand their logo on their skin and tattoo the name of the company on their forehead. And not everyone's like that, and that's fine. It's your baby at the end of the day, and you don't have to force everyone to fall in love with it. Hopefully they do over the course of working for you, which I think has actually been the case with the offshore team. The few devs that we still have on the offshore side that have stayed, is you can tell that those people are now bought in. They're really interested in the product. They're not just clocking in and clocking out. But I think it's okay to also have that mentality of like the employee mindset and not like a founder mindset. Brendan says remote distributed, work from home. What's your ideal? I think this is an important thing to talk about just in remote culture in general, is that quarantine is not remote. It's not work from home either. Like, this sucks for everybody being stuck at your house. I have I've got a pretty nice setup here. Like, this is where I work every day. But I also work on the couch, on the back porch, in the car. I worked for like an hour the other day in a Target parking lot. It was awesome. And I think that flexibility is huge. So I'm not, in favor of one or the other. I'm in favor of the concept of work wherever you want to work. And that ties right into what I said before. This was work as often and whenever you want to work. And that's why I have that flexibility around not being reliant on other people to get your job done, because I want you as an employee to have the flexibility to wake up whenever you feel the most comfortable to wake up. I think that there's this huge misnomer in tech of this like guy that wakes up at 5 a.m., goes to the gym, showers, goes on a morning jog, like eats his breakfast on a balcony and like gets his work done all before like 7 a.m. in the morning. I don't operate like that. Like, sometimes I'm not even going to bed until 4 or 5 a.m. And that's fine. Like, that's the way my body works and the way that I want to live. And the company, should be understanding of that, as long as I'm getting my stuff done. If I'm not, then rules and regulations come into place and a conversation is going to be had. But that's the beauty of remote, is this concept of work wherever, whenever. Bianca says, our junior devs need more specific guidance. We used to do pure work in office and we're doing it right now virtual. How can you mentor junior devs in async? What would you recommend? So this is super valid. Like, this actually just literally happened today. We had a bad commit this morning that broke something with like public shares. And instead of trying to fix it, I was like, dude, just like revert the code. It's not a big deal. The feature wasn't that important. We'll just pull it back. And Derek's at the gym right now, trying to be respectful of his time, even though something's majorly broken on our server, and saying, no, go relax, enjoy your gym time. I'm not going to interrupt you. I said, we'll have this other dev do it. And he's brand new to the team, sort of junior, offshore as well, actually. And I said, we'll just have him do it. And like 20 minutes went by and it hadn't been reverted. And so I slacked him and said like, hey dude, like, are you having any troubles? And he's like, yeah, I'm running into this error message, blah, 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 this thing. And so I said, are you doing this revert over the terminal? And he said, well, yeah, I mean, that's how I do all my Git. I said, just download the GitHub client, man, and right click a commit and revert. Like, it takes 2 seconds. And he just goes, oh man, I wish I would have asked you 15 minutes ago. I said, yep. Like, simple. It's really easy. I know that like someone taught you along the way that, it's cheating to use the GitHub client and that you should do everything over the terminal, but like, this is just a simple way to do it. And we would have reverted this commit, 15 minutes ago if you just asked. So like I think my biggest thing to really answer your question, Bianca, is building a culture of like asking for help when you need it, like just saying, hey, I'm stuck, like I don't know what I'm doing, this was confusing for me, somebody else probably has that answer. And building in a culture of like being able to ask questions and not feeling like it's I guess lowering your self-esteem while you're doing that is really important to junior devs. I think a lot of junior devs in general are afraid of asking because it might make them look stupid. It might give away the card that they are actually a junior dev. And I think that especially with developers in general, you have like two ends of the spectrum. You have a dev that constantly and chronically underestimates themselves. They think they're not that great, but really they're amazing. And then you have the other, which is that they're really, really confident in everything they do, and they don't ask questions because they just definitely know that they're right. And trying to find a balance in the middle, which is like being confident in what you do and then also being okay with asking questions, every once in a while, I think is really important. The devs on our team, I think, have done a really good job of staying in communication with each other to help mentor each other. And that's not something that we have done at an admin level. And I think that what's really great about that is it means that they're building relationships one-on-one, and it doesn't feel like a forced system that the management team is doing, but instead really the devs just have this understanding that they can all reach out to each other to get help. So don't know if that's the best answer in the world, but what we've really done is just kind of build a culture around, reaching out, asking for help, giving help. And that's really been kind of the key to unlocking this issue of a junior dev feeling a little bit siloed, separated away from everybody else because they're not getting the support that they need. Hannah says, how do you handle a PM who is overly cautious? How do we incentivize or support shipping faster when a PM wants to be perfect before shipping? So I have this right now. So we don't have enough staff right now to have a project manager. So I'm basically the project manager, but I have a developer, Derek, who's our lead backend, who wants this PM. And we battle every day on the difference between, this bug wouldn't have happened if we had, proper project management. And no, it's cool, man. Like bugs happen, just like revert the code and, we'll try again. And I think that laissez-faire attitude that I have is very frustrating to him sometimes because he comes with a huge 600-person agency. He sent me a yak the other day about this 60-person strike team that they had that was dedicated just to like crushing bugs, and they would never be working on like anything else besides fixing bugs. He's like, we need this level of organization. I'm like, yeah, dude, but we're like 9 people right now, so that's just not going to happen. So, I think it depends on the size of your team. Do you have the support to do this, to be overly cautious, or do you just straight up not have the manpower for it? And it's better to actually just put something out there and let your users be your testers. I think that I will go down in history as one or the other, right? I will go down in history as the guy who pioneered the move fast and break things, style of just put something out there, and if it breaks, it's not a huge deal. We'll just fix it and put an update out there. 4 people saw it, not 4,000. Versus the difference of being too slow to put stuff out there, right? I will either be the idiot that always shipped bugs, or I will be the savant that figured out that shipping bugs was not that big of a deal. And we'll see how it works out. My typical answer to this is the standard answer of you don't learn if you don't ship. So you could check a million boxes and still have a bug at the end of the day. And so you will always find a PM that is like, it's not ready, it's not ready, it's not ready, right? So there's always like an end line that you will never reach of perfection. And so to try and, hit that level of perfection it is just like a lost cause. There's no reason to do it. So that doesn't say that we don't test and that we don't take our time with stuff. It just means that I take an approach of like good enough and not perfect. And I think a lot of times that's, it goes the opposite way that a lot of people think that it should. But I found that it works for us. Bruno says, can you explain how you do onboarding of new dev team members? I think this is an area that needs a lot of work in startups in general. So I am not going to tell you that we have the perfect solution. I've put every single new hire as answering to me, the CEO, and not anyone else. That just means that I alone take that responsibility for properly onboarding them. We immediately throw them into our stand-ups channel on Yak. That means every day they're getting stand-ups from everybody else. So they just start hearing what everybody else is working on. We have a question of the day that we do in stand-ups as well. So every day we ask just a question of the day. Today, Juan asked, what's your favorite place to like visit in the US? Because he actually just flew into the US for one of the first times ever. And so he just wants to know the best places to visit. And so like new dev team members will also just kind of hear over time like little tidbits about their team and start to learn them. Even if they're not actively participating in those stand-ups yet, they'll start hearing those things, hearing their voices, and start that relationship building. I think that's a big part of it. The other side of it is, properly being able to task them. I will fully admit that sometimes we just don't have work for people, and I will just say, hey, we just don't have anything right now. Chill for like a second before we get this, next release out. You're getting paid, so who cares? We'll get a new, set of tasks for you in like 3 days. I think a lot of times people are afraid of letting someone sit there and not do anything, and they throw them things that are confusing or they don't give them enough support. It's really tough to hire a brand new employee and immediately have work for them. So a lot of times what I'll do is just like, hey, sit tight for like 24, 48 hours. We'll get you stuff in a second. We're about to do a big build. In the meantime, hang out in the stand-ups channel, listen to everybody, download the code, start playing around with it, get comfortable with it, ask questions, and then we'll start giving you tasks. So a lot of that just has to do with that first week kind of being about like learning the code, learning the humans, hearing everyone's voices, understanding what everybody works on, using the tool themselves, and then we'll actually start giving them tasks. Wes says, in your agency experience, were your non-outsourced developer and project silos, or do they work together on either a combined backlog of all projects or a single project that designers, marketers, et cetera, leveraged? Typically we don't really share tasks, because a lot of times, especially with offshore, that can be very frustrating for a lot of people, both on the offshore team and on the local team, because, hey, like they made a bunch of changes and then like they pushed that code, and then I, just double worked because I was unaware that they were making those changes. So we just like stopped sharing tasks, because it ended up being very frustrating for both people, because code was getting like thrown away constantly. And so typically I will have them either work on something like insanely specific. So, we just launched a AI noise removal system for Yak. So now you can yak while there's a plane flying over you, and they just like, you just can't hear that in the background. That's an example of something that's like really, really, really specific that one dev should work on, and they should just like sit on that until it's finished. And then the offshore team should work on like moving a button and changing the text and adding, screen recording to the app, and like, just kind of like these generic features. But this like really intense AI, noise removal system, that's what like a local dev would sit on forever. So again, like we use offshore for scale, so like mass production of stuff. And then we use onshore for like nitpicky, important, high-end development features that they can just sit on and do by themselves. And that has typically ensured that no one's working over each other. So it is sort of siloing, but it's siloing inside of the same project. I think that answers your question. Tyler says, how long do you know, how do you know how long devs are spending on stuff? It's a good question. Tyler's with Hubstaff. Hubstaff is a great time tracking tool for all of our interns, contractors, and offshore teams. We use time tracking just so that they understand how long they're working, we understand how long they're working, and those are typically hourly paid positions. So I get like a button to press to say how much I pay them, which I like. I don't actually check any of the time or stamps or anything like that. It's really just so that everyone can be accountable, I guess, for how much time. In fact, Heather on our team doesn't have to track her time, still uses Hubstaff to track her time, because she just likes having something that tells her, hey, you've been sitting on this for 4 hours. Like that seems like a while. So she can kind of like self-regulate her own work. So time tracking has its time and place. I don't use it maybe the way that a lot of other people use it, but we do still use it. Now, to answer the real question, it's a gut feeling on my end. I'm very big on being aware of like where all of our releases are at any time. And so a lot of times I will work through just like, hey, I haven't seen this feature pop up. Like, where are we at with that? Like, it should not have taken this long. So again, before I give any feature, I am doing the due diligence on my end to think through like how long I think this should take. And if it takes longer than that, I will check in with that dev. Now, conversely, I'm hoping that that developer also will check in with me and say, hey, I've been on this for a while, right? So again, having that kind of like culture around this is taking forever, I feel like it's way more complex than you thought it was. And it's funny, most of the time, the developer's telling me that in some very insulting way, right? Like, you underestimated this feature. It's way more complicated than you thought it was. And I will typically push back and say, like, no, I think you probably just complicated it more than I wanted it, complicated. If it's too complicated and I was wrong, that's fine. We just won't do it. I will just typically just pull the task completely. But I rely on the developer to actually check in and say, hey, I'm not done with this. Otherwise, I'm going off my gut feeling of saying, hey, I haven't seen this yet. Like, why is it taking so long? Wes, let's see. What are some ways to encourage and systemize learning, pairing, reviewing in a cost-efficient way? I think that the asynchronous kind of like status updates and stuff is a really cool way to do that, because you can say, hey, I was working on this. I got stuck on this. Actually, the other day, Emilio just said, his stand up for the day was like, he's setting up TikTok and Snapchat ads, but he needed a credit card to actually finalize it. Right. And I like heard that tidbit, and I just called him and said, hey, I can, read you a credit card online, through the phone if you want to put the credit card in. He's like, oh no, Hunter already took care of it. Right. So like, you hear those little things of like how someone needs help, or what someone might have been doing, and then that gives you an opportunity to reach out. And so we really do encourage you to be detailed with your stand-ups. So especially on the dev side, somebody says, hey, I was stuck on this, or I didn't complete this, or I did complete this, and this is how I did it. Somebody else can kind of passively learn from that and then reach out on their own to say, how did you get past that bug? Or, oh, I've heard of this before. I know how to get past that bug. And so a lot of that has to do with kind of building a culture around admitting, when you're stuck, so that other people know to reach out to say, hey, I can help you with this. What are some tools that you might have used to help create and measure developer efficiency and performance? Do you use anything like OKRs, any simple metrics that universally reveal? So I'm going to be super, super transparent on this one and say, absolutely not. Don't do that. Probably never will. I rely a lot on kind of like gut instinct of like how fast someone's shipping. I'm not going to trust a system to tell me how clean someone's code is, how many commits they made, how fast they coded. Efficiency and performance, I think, are a thing that you just can't automate. It's something that you have to get by working with that person, because each person works very differently. Some developer may do everything all at once in like one gigantic chunk, and it may look like they've taken forever to get work done, but then when they finally push code, it's like 500 things are checked off. And then you have some developers that will send one little chunk here, one little chunk there, and they'll be tiny little tasks, and it's like, man, you're just doing all these like small insignificant items, but then when you look at it over the course, it's like, wow, they actually knocked out like a ton of stuff. It just looked like it was small at the time. So, really it just has to do with communication. What are you working on? What are you putting out? What's being shipped? And understanding that. I really don't rely on any type of tool to get that done. We'll see if that changes in the future, but we don't use anything right now. Dan says, when are the times or cases where you really need to meet with people at the same time? So I always challenge this question and say, when would you need to meet with people at the same time? Like, when is a sync meeting truly needed? A lot of people are like, whiteboarding. And I'm like, why? There's tons of whiteboarding sessions that happen asynchronously. Just think of like Google Slides. You put in a couple slides, somebody else puts in a couple slides, you leave a couple comments, you delete a couple, shapes, and that's all happening asynchronously. Nobody's sitting in Google Slides or Google Docs or Google Sheets all typing at the exact same time. Those tools exist, and there's systems that are there for that, but it's not like the standard use case. So I very clearly rail against this concept that synchronous meetings have to happen or they have to exist. I think first time meetings, onboarding a new dev, hop on a call with them. I think that's important. I think meeting clients and new customers, like those things should happen on nice video calls like this, but I don't think these calls have to happen every day. And I do definitely rail against this concept that like sync meetings where you get everybody on the same page and everybody's in like a synchronous meeting so you can brainstorm all at the same time. I actually don't think they're efficient. I think that relies on everybody in that meeting having the exact same personality of someone who likes to and enjoys thinking, on the spot, on demand, on a stage, on a video call. And not everyone is like that. Some people like to take their time to think over something and then provide feedback. I think a lot of our best work also happens when we talk to ourselves. I talk about this on almost every single webinar, speech, podcast thing that I do, which is rubber duck debugging, which I actually got from Adrian. this concept of talking to a rubber duck when you get stuck, and the rubber duck will solve the issue for you. This happens all the time in Yak. I get so many Yaks of someone on my team saying, hey, like I've got this issue. I don't know where to put this button. I don't know what to do. You know what, never mind, I actually just figured it out, right? And so there's actually a lot of magic that happens when you just speak to yourself, because you externalize your problem for the first time. You're hearing from a different perspective because you were trying to explain it to somebody else. Now all of a sudden you can hear it from what would have been their perspective, and you've figured it out on your own. So I'm a really big proponent of this concept that nothing has to be, real-time synchronous brainstorming with everybody. You could always accomplish the exact same thing asynchronously. And actually, in most cases, I firmly believe that that's actually the better way to do it, because it's respectful of everyone's time. It's inclusive of everybody's style and the way that they prefer to work. And a lot of times it actually helps you critically think through problems yourself. Let's see. Adrian Santos says, did you cross-platform or for Yak or separate? Yes, this is a great question. So we're all React Native for our mobile. It definitely helps us ship fast. So it has its ups and downs. It has its pros and cons. I'm a huge fan of, especially depending on your platform. I think Clubhouse is like a really great example of this. Clubhouse could be iOS only forever, and it wouldn't matter at all, because it only needs a solo person to enjoy it. For Yak, it's a team tool, and we know that teams have Android, iOS, Mac, Windows, Linux, Chromebooks, whatever. It had to be on all platforms because it needs team adoption for it to even, work as a team system. So we did do cross-platform development. Our desktop app is based on Electron. Our web app is React and Vue for a different part of the desktop app. And then mobile is React Native. I'm a huge fan of React Native in general from a hiring perspective, because it's a cheaper way to hire, because you can hire any React developer. They don't have to be a Swift, Kotlin, Android developer for mobile. They can just be a JavaScript developer, and then they can learn mobile development from that. So it's way easier to find talent to hire from. It's much more difficult to find a Swift developer anywhere, but especially in the States, there's tons of JavaScript developers. There's not a lot of like Swift developers all looking for jobs. So it's way easier to hire for that role. And on top of that, it means that if at any point in time, let's say you like have some downtime or a major bug on your mobile app, and one of your developers is out sick, any of your other developers from any other half of your stack, if you're Node or React based on web or backend, can probably hop in and fix that because they understand JavaScript. So there's a number of reasons that I did it, not just for having one code base that we can split on multiple platforms, but also for hiring reasons as well. How do you manage your equity shares for people inside your company before raising? So founders had equity. We had equity promised outside of a founder pool or a employee pool for anybody that was coming in as like a key hire, like head of growth or CTO or CFO, as well as like first key hires, specifically around like development heads. And so that all came out of a employee pool that we set aside in advance. And we're just pulling from that each time we make a key hire. Do your developers focus on coding, or do they have other responsibilities as well? Sales calls, blah, 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 stakeholder interviews. Or are they only responsible for coding execution? Is there a price to do the other things? Are there ways to address assigning seemingly non-technical or coding tasks to developers? For us, we're creating a solutions architect role. Yeah, I mean, coders are coding. That's all they're ever doing. Like I said earlier in another question, we may want to have them hop on like a demo call so that they can get through some of the understanding of how a customer is using the product. But we keep them very, very centered on what they are good at. And I think there's also a huge part of that is what they want to be doing. There's a huge part of a company that is reliant upon understanding what each person in that company wants to do. And putting someone in a role that they don't want to be in, they're uncomfortable in, is just not going to lead to good retention of your employees. So we're really big on putting someone where they want to be. Doesn't mean that you don't ever push someone to maybe do something they didn't think that they wanted to do. But I think that there's a culture side that's very important to not making your employees uncomfortable in their day-to-day job. Dominique says, how do you make sure Emilio knows what to do for content, keeping the values of the company? How do you feel about having a Yak Twitter account instead of just tweet yourself as a person? Yeah, I mean, Emilio does tweet things that don't represent company values, and we just yell at him for it. So it happens. Like, it's totally a thing. You will always have someone who thought something was like on brand and it wasn't on brand. Typically it's just learned over time. One of the biggest things that Emilio does, I think, in general, is watch how all of us as founders tweet, and just kind of like, copying a lot of like the style. What's funny now is Emilio actually often logs into my Twitter account to run it for me because I have pretty good traction sometimes. And I actually can't tell the difference between my tweets and his tweets now. He's gotten to the point where he knows how I speak online, that he's so good about doing his own content that I can't even tell if it's me or not sometimes. And then your second question, just about Twitter account or company Twitter account versus a personal account. We're really, really big on personal accounts. We will almost never respond to someone talking about our product as the company account, unless it's like a meme or a GIF or something. I will always dive in there as a human and say, hey, I'd love for you to try the product. Doing it from a personal perspective is so much better than doing it from a brand perspective. Why is your app called Yak? Yelling across cubicles. That's what Yak stands for. How do you encourage devs in a small team to remain accountable to timeline and update their progress on software like Jira? It's tough. It's really tough. Right now, I'll be really honest and say, like, we just don't have a system for it. Derek's mad at me for not having like this massive project management system in place, but I'm very adamant about this. Look, we do not have time to manage that. We need to ship product. We do not have a dedicated PM person working for us right now. Once we do, more than happy to have somebody like run that and keep everybody accountable. And I think that role is important. And we are hiring for that role. But we don't right now. And that just means it's not getting done because I don't want to half-ass something. I'm not going to have a system in place. And this happens a lot with us, is we'll have a system in place. No one will follow it. And then you're just not quite sure where information is because it's supposed to be in the system, but it's not always in the system. And so you just end up asking somebody for the information anyway, and then they're annoyed that it's, you didn't just check the system. So I've taken the approach of like, look, it either 100% of the time in a GitHub ticket and you will never have to ask me, or I will never have to ask you, or we're just not using the system and we're going to use communication instead. How do you plan release versions? I'm really bad at it. I just like fire versions off all the time. In fact, users have even complained in the early days that they were like too many updates. I typically take the stance of like, ship it, just get it out there. This applies to a lot of things: marketing initiatives, designs, product hunt launches. I guess we plan far in advance and have all of our assets ready. But in terms of actually doing like a new release for a product, we do have a change log on our website. And when something needs to get pushed, it just gets pushed. I don't like spending a ton of time trying to figure out when and how to push something. Oh man, I'm so close and I'm 1 minute over. So I'm just going to blow through this if you guys are okay with that. How do you motivate your developers? Money. I think like that's a huge misnomer in tech, is that you have to motivate your developers. I think if you pay them well and you treat them well and they enjoy your company and they like the people that they work with, they will want to show up every day and they will want to work. I think that it's a huge misfire to think that you have to like make them like the product and motivate them in other ways. At the end of the day, it's a job and people like to get paid for that job and they like to, feel like they're comfortable in that job. So money is the best way to motivate someone. If you were a solopreneur and that doesn't have much technical know-how to build an app, at what point do you suggest hiring a freelancer versus continuing to learn and do it yourself? Great question, Emilio. In general, I take the stance of like, you should always learn. But if that's not what you want to be doing with your life, coding, then hire, an offshore team or a freelancer. You should still learn so that you know if that person's bullshitting you or not, or if they're lying, or if they're out of their depth, right? Like I have enough knowledge to know if a dev is a good dev or not. I'm not going to go code myself because I really hate that. I don't want to do it, but I could if I wanted to. I just really don't like that job. So I always encourage learning because it puts you in a better position for hiring purposes. You can be a better entrepreneur because you have this knowledge now. It means you can make better hiring decisions. You can make better firing decisions. You can make better product decisions. Is this complicated? Is it not complicated? All that comes from knowledge of knowing how to do it yourself. Doesn't mean you actually have to do it yourself though. JP, do you have a QA process in place for your software products? So that's a really, really great way to use offshore. So we have a dedicated QA person on the offshore side. There's a full QA team. She does full like Excel spreadsheets with test cases, updates all of our GitHub tickets, tests every single build before it goes live. And it is a great thing to just push off on somebody else because QA can be very systematic. Obviously, there's a style of it where you want to understand and know, the product and understand if something's like a bug or just like something that shouldn't work that way. But over time, a QA person will also understand that. At this point, she actually beats me a lot of times on presenting something that I go, I didn't even think about that. You're right. It's totally shouldn't be like that because she's in the app every single day doing QA constantly. So I highly, highly recommend that if you don't have a QA person on your side, just hire an offshore team to do your QA. It's so worth it. It's low cost. It's something you don't even have to think about. And you can just watch those GitHub tickets roll in. It's very satisfying, actually. So I know we had a lot in the chat that weren't in the QA, but I didn't answer those because you didn't go through the right system. But we are at the top of the hour, a little bit over. So if anybody has follow-up questions, yak.com/jmitch, that's my yak. Would absolutely love to answer any more questions there. It's the best way to get a hold of me because it's async and I can answer anytime and I can answer high bandwidth like I am right now. Other than that, definitely check out Yak. If you sign up using my link, you'll automatically get an account and add me as a friend and we can connect there. I'm also at jmitch on Twitter and I love talking on Twitter, so I'm happy to do it there. All right, I guess that's the end of my rant, Justine, if you want to come back online and get everybody off.
Thanks again for this, Justin. It was awesome. And if any of you aren't on Yak, be sure to check it out and hop on there. I'm there as well. So thanks again for everyone for joining us. We'll be sending out this recording tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that as well. And I hope you all have a great day.